The wind screamed across the plains like an angry spirit, slicing through the women's ragged clothing, clawing at exposed skin until every nerve felt like raw fire. Abigail Thompson forced her legs forward through deep snowdrifts, each step heavier and more painful than the last. Behind her, three other women stumbled through the merciless winter storm, all of them barely recognizable beneath layers of frost and desperation. The settlers at Fort Hanover had branded them troublemakers, women who wouldn't quietly obey, who dared to speak their minds and challenge men who thrived on dominance. Abigail's only crime had been defiance, a refusal to marry the aging preacher whose gaze lingered too long. Emily had been banished for defending her younger sister against abuse, Mary for challenging the sheriff's cruelty, and Rebecca for daring to stand between her husband and her child's suffering. Each woman carried a burden heavier than mere survival. Each had tasted the bitter sting of betrayal by the very people who promised protection. Abigail turned, squinting against the relentless white. Emily was falling behind again, her red hair now crusted white with ice, her once vibrant green eyes dull and glassy. Mary moved beside her, gripping Emily's elbow tightly, offering silent strength despite the bruises darkening her own face. Rebecca limped slowly behind, one hand pressed tightly against her ribs, her breathing ragged. They were all dangerously close to breaking. "We can't stop," Abigail called out, her voice barely audible above the howling storm. "Keep moving." Emily raised her head slightly, meeting Abigail's eyes with despair. "How much further?" Her words were hardly more than a whisper, cracked and raw. "I don't know," Abigail admitted, her heart aching at the sight of her friend's fading strength. "But stopping means death. We can't let them win." The memory of Fort Hanover burned hot beneath Abigail's frozen skin. The smirking faces of the men as they dragged the women outside the gates. The cheers of a crowd eager for spectacle. They'd cast them into the wilderness expecting weakness, expecting surrender. Abigail clenched her fists, nails biting into numb palms. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Hours melted into an endless blur of snow and wind. The women's movement slowed, exhaustion dragging at limbs too numb to feel pain, their bodies screaming silently for rest. The land around them stretched forever, empty and hostile beneath skies gray and unfeeling. Suddenly, a cry cut through the wind's moan. Abigail turned sharply, panic flooding her veins. Emily had collapsed, crumpled helplessly in a drift. Abigail lunged toward her, dropping to her knees beside the fallen woman, ignoring the cold seeping through her dress. She shook Emily gently, fear squeezing her chest. "Emily, stand up," Abigail urged desperately. "Please, we can't stop." Emily barely moved, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her skin was dangerously pale, lips blue. Mary knelt beside them, rubbing Emily's hands roughly, trying to spark warmth back into her failing body. "I can't feel anything," Emily whispered. Her eyes fluttered closed, snowflakes settling softly on her eyelashes. "No," Abigail said firmly, grabbing Emily's chin and forcing her to look up. "We will not die here, not like this." But even as she spoke, Abigail felt her own strength wavering, doubts worming their way into her mind. The other women stared at her, hope fading from their eyes. They were trapped, doomed by the merciless cold, by men who believed women disposable. Then came the growl. Low and predatory, it rippled through the storm, sending shivers of primal fear down Abigail's spine. She looked up slowly, dread gripping her heart. Wolves emerged from the swirling snow, eyes glowing yellow with hunger. They were lean, desperate beasts, their fur patchy and darkened by hunger. They moved in a slow, calculated circle, cutting off any escape, instinctively sensing the women's vulnerability. Rebecca whimpered, clutching at her injured ribs. Mary stood stiffly, her eyes narrowed but her hands empty. Emily lay helpless on the snow, barely conscious. Abigail reached down, grabbing a small branch hidden beneath the snow, gripping it like a weapon, even though she knew it was hopeless. The largest wolf lunged first, jaws snapping inches from Abigail's face. She swung wildly, striking its side with enough force to make it yelp and jump back. The others edged closer, growling deep in their throats, preparing to strike. "This can't be how it ends," Mary whispered hoarsely, stepping closer to Abigail, fists clenched at her sides. The wolves crouched, ready to spring, and then an arrow cut through the howling wind with deadly precision. It struck the lead wolf, sending it sprawling, its snarls turning to pained whimpers as it died. Another arrow hissed through the air, embedding itself deep into another wolf's flank. The pack scattered in panic, disappearing into the snowy darkness as swiftly as they'd appeared. Abigail whipped around, heart pounding in disbelief. From the storm's swirling shadows, figures emerged, wrapped tightly in thick furs, bows drawn and eyes sharp and watchful. Lakota warriors. Fear seized Abigail once more. Settlers had always spoken of the Lakota in hushed, fearful whispers, calling them ruthless savages, but now standing in the snow, helpless and shivering, Abigail saw only strength, calm, and perhaps salvation. One warrior stepped forward, tall and imposing. He lowered his bow slightly, eyes unreadable as he scanned their battered group. He spoke softly, a deep voice barely audible above the storm, words she didn't understand. "Help us," Abigail pleaded softly, her voice breaking with exhaustion. "Please." The warrior stared silently, his eyes lingering on Emily's motionless form, then back at Abigail's desperate face. She held his gaze unflinching, refusing to surrender even now. After an endless heartbeat, he nodded once, sharply, and gestured toward the other warriors. Immediately they moved with swift efficiency, gently lifting Emily's unconscious form, steadying Mary, supporting Rebecca. Abigail felt strong hands helping her to stand. She leaned into them gratefully, her last reserves of strength dissolving. As darkness blurred her vision, Abigail felt warmth spread through her frozen body, not just from the hands that now carried her away from certain death, but something deeper. For the first time since they'd been cast out, she felt hope flicker faintly back to life. The settlers had abandoned them, leaving them to freeze, certain of their death. But Abigail and the others had survived, rescued by those they had been taught to fear. Their journey wasn't over, it was only beginning. And Abigail knew deep in her soul they would not merely survive, they would reclaim everything that had been stolen from them. Warmth came slowly, not just to the body, but to the spirit. Abigail's eyes fluttered open to the soft glow of a fire, the faint scent of pine smoke and crushed herbs hanging in the air. For a long moment, she thought she might be dreaming, no longer surrounded by endless white, but enclosed in a rounded hide structure, protected from the wind. A blanket had been tucked tightly around her body, and her boots, once stiff with ice, sat drying near the fire. She shifted and pain bloomed across her back and legs. Not a dream, but not death either. "You are safe." The voice was calm and firm, a woman's. Abigail turned her head slowly to find a figure seated beside her, a woman with dark braids adorned with tiny carved beads and a face that bore the strength of a mountain. Her eyes, though sharp, held no malice, only deep assessment. "Where?" Abigail's voice cracked painfully. The woman offered her a small bowl of steaming broth. "Our winter camp. You were found near the forest's edge. The wolves were close." Abigail accepted the bowl with trembling hands. The warmth spread through her fingers first, then her arms, then her chest as she sipped. It was strong, earthy, seasoned with roots and bark, but it revived her more than any food she'd had in weeks. "My friends," she rasped. "They are alive, resting, weak but healing." Tears burned at the corners of Abigail's eyes, but she blinked them away. She would weep later, when they were alone, when the mask of strength was no longer needed. For now she nodded. The woman stood. "I am White Fawn. You are safe here, for now. But this is not a place where outsiders often walk." Abigail swallowed hard. "We didn't mean to intrude. We were left to die." White Fawn paused, studying her with unreadable eyes. "We know what that means." And with that, she turned and left, the flap of the lodge rustling closed behind her. Over the next days, the women were tended to with surprising gentleness. White Fawn and several others brought them food, checked their wounds, and made sure they moved, even if only a little. Eliza was the first to fully regain her strength, walking slowly outside the lodge to take in the camp that had saved them. The Lakota moved like wind and river, graceful, efficient, unhurried but never still. Tents were arranged in a circular pattern around central fires. Smoke curled upward into the sky, carrying the scent of roasted meat, burning cedar, and wet earth. Children darted between tents, their laughter light and bright despite the cold. Warriors patrolled the perimeter with quiet purpose. It was a world unlike any Abigail had known, structured not by rigid rules or fear, but by rhythm, respect, and survival. She found Maggie pacing outside her own lodge, wrapped in a thick fur. Her breath steamed as she moved, boots crunching softly over snow-packed ground. "I need to move or I'll go mad," Maggie said, stretching her arms overhead. "Feels strange not to be freezing to death." Abigail smiled faintly. "Strange, but welcome." Maggie nodded, then looked out toward the distant hills. "Do you think they're still looking for us?" "No," Abigail said, and she didn't need to think about it. "They think we're dead. Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Not far off, Mary sat quietly with White Fawn, watching her prepare bundles of herbs and roots. Though Mary didn't speak much, her eyes followed each movement carefully. Her hands mimicked White Fawn's in subtle ways, and Abigail wondered if she, too, was learning. Slowly, in silence. Rebecca remained inside, her ribs still healing, but she was stronger every day. She had begun humming to herself when she thought no one was listening. Little melodies that reminded Abigail of gentler times. Emily, too, was recovering. She rarely spoke, but her eyes were brighter now, the frost that had once dulled them thawing. They were alive, each of them slowly returning from the edge of death. But survival was not the same as living. It was Chaska who returned next. Abigail didn't see him approach. One moment she was stacking firewood near a lodge. The next he was there, his presence as quiet as a shadow, his eyes sharp and steady. He wore thick layers of fur and leather, his long hair bound back. His bow rested on his shoulder, and his knife hung at his hip. "You are stronger," he observed. She looked up at him. "Thanks to you." He nodded once. "Wolves do not wait for those who fall." Abigail straightened. "And what about people? Do you?" Chaska's gaze lingered on her face. "We wait for those who are worth saving." Abigail didn't answer. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't betray the storm in her chest. He looked out toward the hills. "There is a thaw coming, but the storm behind you is not done." She stepped closer, voice low. "You know why we were out there?" "Yes." "They tried to erase us." Chaska turned to her, his voice calm but weighty. "And yet you remain." That night the women gathered around the central fire. The stars above the camp blinked bright against an endless sky. The flames danced in the wind, casting their faces in golden flickers. No one spoke for a long time. Finally Emily whispered, "I dreamed I was back, in the snow, alone again." "You're not," Abigail said softly. "None of us are." "We can't stay here forever," Mary said, her voice low but steady. "We're not meant to," Abigail replied, "but we're not going back empty." Maggie leaned forward. "What are we going back to?" Abigail met her gaze. "To remind them we didn't die. To show them what happens when the people you cast out don't vanish." A beat passed. Maggie nodded slowly. "Then we'll make sure they never forget." The fire popped, sending sparks into the sky. Abigail looked around at the women, scarred, worn, but not broken. They had survived the cold, the wolves, and the abandonment of their own kind. And now in the warmth of a people they barely knew, they found something more. Resolve. The storm had changed them, but it hadn't ended them, and it never would. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, one that did not belong to comfort, but to healing. Not the soft kind of healing that comes with laughter and tea, but the slow, difficult rebuilding of shattered things. The Lakota did not offer pity, but they offered presence. And for Abigail and the others, that was more than enough. Maggie had taken to helping with tasks around the camp. She carried firewood, hauled water from the stream, even helped tie down the hides on one of the lodges when the wind whipped too hard. Her hands, once soft with calluses worn from embroidery, had hardened again, but this time with purpose. "They don't talk much," she murmured one morning, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold. "Words aren't their first language," Abigail replied, watching two young Lakota boys race across the snow. "They speak with what they do." Mary, now walking without a limp, spent much of her time with White Fawn. The healer showed her how to grind roots, bind wounds, and recognize which herbs soothe fever and which ones numb pain. Mary rarely smiled, but Abigail saw something return to her, something buried when her child was taken, a quiet determination. Rebecca had regained her voice, not in grand speeches but in the way she hummed to herself while stitching blankets, or offered a kind glance to a young Lakota girl who had brought her food. There was still pain in her posture, a stiffness in how she moved, but it no longer held her captive. Emily, of all of them, remained a mystery. She wandered the camp slowly, sometimes sitting for hours near the horses, watching the way they breathed, the way their muscles twitched under thick winter coats. A few of the younger Lakota men nodded to her in passing, but she said little. Yet when night fell, she always returned to the fire, to the women, to what little safety they had built together. And Abigail, she watched it all. She absorbed every moment, every gesture, like it was a story she had been waiting to understand. She caught Chaska's gaze often. He never stared, never lingered too long, but he watched her too. Not with possession, not with expectation, but with a curiosity that was careful, controlled. One evening, as the sun bled gold into the snowy hills, Abigail stood at the edge of the camp watching the horizon. "You think of returning?" She turned. Chaska stood a few feet away, arms folded, the wind tugging at his fur-lined coat. "I think of justice," she said. Chaska nodded once. "Justice and revenge are not always strangers." Abigail met his gaze. "They threw us out like we were nothing. They stole our homes, our voices, our children. We lived, and they want to forget we ever did." His brow furrowed slightly. "And you wish to remind them. I want to look them in the eye and say, you failed. I want to make sure no other woman is cast into snow and silence again." A silence passed between them. Then Chaska stepped closer. "You are fire," he said, "but fire without focus can destroy." "I don't want to destroy," Abigail whispered. "I want to be seen." He studied her, then unhooked something from his belt. A small blade, carved from bone and wrapped in dyed leather. He held it out. "For when being seen is not enough." Abigail took the blade carefully, the weight of it both foreign and right. That night around the fire, Abigail spoke. "We're leaving," she said. "Soon." The others turned to her, some startled, some already expecting it. "To where?" Maggie asked. "Home." A bitter laugh slipped from Rose. "That place stopped being home the second they locked the door behind us." "Then let's make it ours again," Abigail said. "Let's walk in alive and let them see what survived their cruelty. Not ghosts, not victims. Us." Mary's fingers clenched around the herbs she had been sorting. "We'll never be safe there." "No," Abigail agreed, "but neither will they. Not if they think we'll stay quiet." Rebecca glanced toward the fire. "We'll need help." "We won't go alone," Abigail said. "Chaska and some of the warriors, they know why this matters." Emily finally spoke, her voice quiet. "Will it change anything?" Abigail met her eyes. "Maybe not for them, but for every woman after us, it will." By dawn, the women stood at the edge of the Lakota camp, wrapped in thick furs, their packs slung across their backs. Horses waited, breathing clouds into the morning air. Chaska stood with 5 other warriors, his gaze unreadable. "We ride with you to the edge," he said, "but not into your town." Abigail nodded. "It's not your fight." He stepped closer. "Number. But I have seen enough to know it's a worthy one." He turned to his warriors, barked a few commands in Lakota. They mounted swiftly with practiced ease. The women climbed into their saddles with a little more difficulty, but with far more resolve than they had known weeks ago. They rode. The wind lashed their faces. The snow grew deeper with every mile. But their backs were straight, their eyes sharp. The land they crossed no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a proving ground. By the time they reached the tree line that overlooked the town, the sun hung low in the sky. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children's laughter echoed faintly through the woods. It looked the same, but they knew better. Chaska halted his horse. "This is as far as we go." Abigail turned to him, something unspoken passing between them. "Thank you," she said. He didn't respond. He simply handed her a length of braided leather. "For your hands, for holding your blade, or your friend, whichever you need more." She took it, fingers brushing his. Goodbye, Abigail. Goodbye, Chaska. Then without another word, he turned and rode into the trees, his warriors close behind. Abigail turned to the others. Their faces were pale with cold, but alive with something fierce. This is it, she said. No one questioned her. They rode toward the town, not as ghosts returning from death, but as women who had walked through fire, nor had become the flame. The town looked unchanged, but Abigail knew better. As she and the other women rode down the snow-covered main street, silence fell like a blanket. The morning sun glinted off frosted window panes, but behind those windows, curtains twitched. Faces appeared, pale and wide-eyed. Whispers began to ripple through the town like wind through brittle leaves. They're back. Is that Abigail Monroe? They were supposed to be dead. Boots clicked against the wooden planks of the boardwalk as Sheriff Harlan stepped out of his office, squinting into the sun. His hand hovered near the pistol on his hip, but he didn't draw. He wasn't stupid, just used to holding power. That grip was slipping fast. Abigail dismounted, the crunch of snow beneath her boots sharp in the silence. Her eyes locked on the sheriff's. "You remember us," she said, her voice calm, measured. Not angry, not pleading, just certain. He blinked, jaw tight. "You shouldn't be here." "No," Maggie said, stepping beside her, arms crossed. "You made sure of that when you threw us out into the snow like broken furniture." Mary, Rebecca, Rose, and Emily stood behind them. No weapons raised, no voices raised, just presence. That was louder than any gunshot. The townsfolk emerged slowly, a few at first, then more. The blacksmith's apprentice, the preacher's wife, even Mrs. Hale, who had told Eliza once that a woman should know her place. They all watched, waiting. "What is this?" barked a man in the back. Tom Harrow, Eliza's former neighbor. "Some kind of revenge?" Abigail turned to him. "Number, this is remembrance. We remember what you did, what you allowed." Harrow laughed bitterly. "You come back after all this time expecting what? Sympathy?" "No," Maggie snapped. "We expect truth. We expect you to look at what you've done and live with it." A murmur spread again. Some looked ashamed. Others turned away. Then Hannah stepped forward. She hadn't spoken since they left the camp, but now her voice was clear, unshaken. "I came for my son." From the church steps, a woman stepped forward slowly, holding a small boy by the hand. The child looked at Hannah, blinking, uncertain. "That's Daniel," Hannah said, breath catching in her throat. The woman, her sister-in-law, stared at her, arms tightening around the boy. "You gave him up." "No," Hannah said. "You took him. When I was weak, when I couldn't fight back. But I'm here now." The woman's jaw trembled, but the boy stepped forward. He looked at Hannah, then up at the woman beside him, and chose. He walked toward Hannah, hand outstretched. Tears spilled down Hannah's cheeks, but she didn't collapse. She crouched and wrapped her arms around him like steel. "He's coming home," she said. Sheriff Harlan took a step forward. "That boy's been raised here. We've all cared for him." "You stood by while she was thrown into a blizzard," Rebecca shouted, "while all of us were cast out like dogs." Abigail faced the sheriff again. "We're not asking permission. We're not here for blood. But we won't be silent either." Tom Harrow scoffed. "So what now? You just live here again? Like nothing happened?" "No," Abigail said. "Like everything happened and we survived it." More silence. It was thick, tangled with guilt, discomfort, denial. But no one moved to stop them, not this time. Abigail turned, scanning the faces. "You tried to erase us. You failed. And now every girl in this town will remember what you did. Every wife, every mother, every daughter. They'll know someone stood up and said, 'Enough.'" Rose smirked. "That's the thing about ghosts. They tend to haunt." Maggie stepped to Tom Harrow, stopping inches from him. "You owe me land and a reckoning," he sneered. "And what if I don't give it back?" "You'll sleep with one eye open the rest of your life," Maggie whispered, "because I'll still be here." Behind them, the Lakota warriors had appeared at the edge of town, silent, watching, not interfering, just present. Like shadows waiting for a reason to move, the message was clear. You're not alone anymore. A few men lowered their eyes, a few women began whispering. The sheriff rubbed his temples and muttered, "God help us." He wasn't praying. He was conceding. Abigail took one final look around. "We've said what we came to say. What comes next is up to you." She turned to the women. "Let's ride." They mounted their horses, slowly, without fear. As they rode, no one blocked their way, no hands raised, just silence and the soft crunch of hooves on snow. At the edge of town, Chaska waited, his face unreadable. But when Abigail met his eyes, he gave the faintest nod. "You did it." She returned it. And then they rode, into the hills, into the wind, into a future they had carved themselves. They weren't just survivors. They were a warning, a spark, and maybe if the world was lucky, a beginning.